Hello, everyone. My name is Túbọ. I am very happy to be here today to give you a talk that I have titled Lingua, Fracas, Problems and Opportunities for Linguistics in African Literature in Translation. I've come to this topic from the perspective of my experience over the last couple of years, working in literary translation, working in language technology, working in advocacy for African languages on the internet, and the perspective of a writer and linguist myself who has worked for years translating literature. So I'm hoping that in the next couple of minutes, 30 minutes or so, I'm able to share some of my perspective and experience and things I've learned, and hope that it provides some perspective and input and directions for those who might want to work in this direction, and for those already working there to understand the kind of challenges we deal with. I am going to have my slide up in a second, but let me see if I can improve the lighting of this space. Give me a second. Okay, I think this is much better. Okay. Thank you. So I'm going to share my screen and then I'll begin the presentation. 1 second. All right. I swear everybody can see my screen now. Lingua Fracas, Problems and Opportunities for Linguistics in African Literature in Translation. So, like I said earlier, I'm a linguist. I'm a creative writer. I've done some work over the last decade or so in translation, in creative writing, in literature, in language advocacy, language technology. I worked for Google, at Google for a few years. Currently, I'm working on a translation of a collection of poems by a writer called Emily Grosholz. She's based in Philadelphia. This is going to go to the press in a couple of weeks. The book is titled Childhood, and some of the things I'm going to mention in this talk come from my experience in translation, like I said, over the last couple of years, but also in this particular work I'm working on. So let's start with why translation is important. In Africa, we have about 2,000 languages and about 7,000 languages in the world. This is a lot. And to be able to understand each other, to be able to speak to each other's experiences, life experiences, we need to be able to get into understanding each other's worldview and point of view. So this is why translation is important. To be able to have a world in which wars and conflict is brought to a minimum, we need to be able to understand why, what each other is thinking about and why they're thinking about it. Translation is what transforms everything so that nothing else changes. I guess this is Montagrass, which I guess means that you get to bring the words from one language to another, which is the language in which the word, not the language in which the word is originally written, but yet you keep the sense of the text in the same way that people who read it in a different language get the same sense that you have in the original language. Part of my work over the last couple of years has been looking at why much of the work that has been translated has always gone into English. Many of us know why this is the case. English is the hegemonic language. It's the world's global means of communication. Even though it doesn't have the largest number of speakers, I believe Mandarin and Arabic have larger numbers. But English seems to have the distinguished honor of, taking all the words and works produced around the world into itself. And it's done this not just in literature, it's done it even in lexicography, where new words come into English all the time, and taken from different parts of the world. Bungalow comes from Hindi, for instance. Alcohol comes from Arabic, etc. In literature, it's been the same. When you go online and you try to look for grants to publish in to translate works from one language to another, you would find many more grants to translate work into English, which is a good thing. It's not a bad thing that people who speak English get to experience literature from other parts of the world. But when that's the only options you have, then it's a problem, because then other languages, as a result of being pilfered, so to speak, of their own stories and worldviews without getting anything in return, they lose something. People who live and exist only in Yorùbá, for instance, which is a language I speak, or in Igbo or Swahili or any other African language, do not get the benefits of reading works that have been produced in English in their own language. So Shakespeare, for instance, 152 or so poems is written, exists in many languages of the world. They can experience Shakespeare. It doesn't exist in Yoruba. Not enough has been done to transmit Shakespeare to Yoruba. So if we believe that literature is important and that learning from others is a good thing and a way to expand our worldview, then literature should exist in every language, and we should be able to transmit them from one language into the one we speak. So my work has been looking at opportunities that exist in bringing works from any language of the world into my own mother tongue, Yoruba, which is one of the reasons I'm working on this collection of poetry. So another problem we have in Nigeria, which stems from colonialism and then extends to issues of attitude, language attitude, is that when we think of literature in the country, we think only of literature in English. When you hear anything about Nigerian literature, you most likely are hearing about the literature that has been written in English, sometimes, mostly by Nigerians themselves who speak their own different languages but choose instead to write in English. And so when you go to school, high school, and you take literature as a subject, what you get is works that have been written by only those who speak in English. There are works that have been published, translated into African languages, but they're very few. I will get to that in a second. But you have even works that have been written in French and Portuguese and other colonial African languages, then get translated into English and then read in Nigerian schools. So even though French is kind of one of the semi-second languages we speak in Nigeria, the work by Kamara Laye, An African Child, was not read usually in French, it's read in English. But more sadly, it's not read in any African language. Not even Chinua Achebe's Apart has been translated into Igbo, which is his own first language. We have it in Yoruba, but not in Igbo. So, and those works that exist are used in schools only for those who are learning those languages. So Things Fall Apart in Yoruba would be read by people learning Yoruba in university, rather than people just learning literature in the end. Even though many Nigerian students speak their own mother tongue, when they go to school, the medium of instruction is only English. So I'm going to give you a short example of some of the works that have been translated into by Nigerians or into Nigerian languages. This is one of the most famous. Wole Soyinka in 1968 translated this book, Ogidigbó Nínú Igbó Irúnmọlẹ̀, from English, from Yoruba into English. He called it The Forest of a Thousand Demons. Fagunwa, who wrote the book originally, is still one of the most prominent, and one of the most known, and one of the most prolific writers in Yoruba. And his work, his 5 novels, become the primary literature in Yoruba canon. So Soyinka doing this into English helped expand the readership of Fagunwa's work and inspired many other writers like Amos Tutuola, who took to the style of Fagunwa but wrote his own work in English. There's this other one, Ibisiaye Okonkwo, written by Wale Wien. It is a translation of Things Fall Apart. Again, interesting because Things Fall Apart doesn't exist in Igbo and many other African languages, but it exists in Yoruba, written by Wale Wien in 1997. The third prominent one and the last I'm going to show here is Ikolokwenshi, which is written by Kiyomi Shola, a professor of Yoruba, in 1994, but which is a translation of Death and the King's Husband, published by Wole Soyinka in 1976. What is interesting about these three works is that only two of them translate into an African language, that is the Ikolokwenshi and Ibisiaye Okonkwo. The other one translates back from a Nigerian language, Yoruba, into English. And also in one of them, the Nigerian writer is translating a work written by an Igbo man, Chinua Achebe, in English into Yoruba. So the language seems to have gone through kind of roundabout way to get into Yoruba, from an Igbo mind into an English text and back into Yoruba. It's to be interesting to study what kind of things happen when this kind of movements happen. The third one, of course, is the Ikolokwenshi, which I think, well, this is not my theory. Tunde Adegbola, my mentor, says there's something called retrieval, in which a work that has been written by a person of a certain language in English gets translated into that original person's language. That what is happening is not translation really, but a retrieval, in which case you are getting the ideas originally conceived in a language and written in a different language back into the original language in which it was conceived. So when Soyinka writes in English, the theory is that he is thinking in Yoruba while writing. When Achebe writes in English, he is thinking in Igbo. And when those works are translated back into those original languages where the writers are from, we are giving the language back to its original state. And it's kind of retrieving what source the language had come from initially and bringing it back into it from English. Very interesting. And so, Forest of a Thousand Demons introduced Fagunwa to a global audience. I mistakenly wrote Fagunwa. There should be an N there instead of an N, so please ignore that. For Okonkwo, it expanded the reach of Achebe's storytelling genius into Yoruba space. For Olokwenshi, like I said, it retrieves Yoruba back into the original language. Three important approaches, three different impacts of these translations. But there are problems as well. In this case, I want to showcase a particular issue I have had a problem with in the translation of Wole Soyinka's translation of Dio Fagunwa's work by Wole Soyinka as A Forest of a Thousand Demons. It begins straight from the first sentence, where the author wrote, "Ẹ̀yin ọ̀rẹ́ mi, bí òwe là ń lùlù Ogidigbó, ọlọ́gbọ́n ní jó, ọ̀mọ̀ràn ní sì ń mọ̀." I've underlined one word there, Ogidigbó. Before I go on, you would notice that many of the words in this texts were not properly tone marked. If you don't speak Yoruba, you would not even know that they're not properly tone marked. But they're not. Many of them are not tone marked at all. Some are tone marked. It's kind of an irregular way Fagunwa did his work. And one of the things we probably need to do as well is to get this work back in with proper tone marking, and I'll tell you why this is the case much later. But the word here is Ogidigbó, which refers to a kind of drum. I'm going to give you the definition I found in Yoruba dictionary. It's a kind of drum made of a block of wood, hollowed out and beaten with a rod. Said to have been introduced during the reign of Ajun. It's beaten when the Alafi and Basharon dance on annual festivals. So Ogidigbó. So there's a saying that Fagunwa cites there, says, "Lowe lowe la nlulu Ogidigbó, ọlọ́gbọ́n ló ń jó ọ̀mọ̀ràn ní mọ̀," which means basically that the Ogidigbó drum is beaten with proverbs loaded into it, and only the wise can dance it, only the smart can understand it. So this is a special kind of drum. But when Shoyinka translated it, he called it, he said, "My friends, like the sonorous proverb, do we drum the Ogidigbó?" In this case, he has changed the word, but he has changed it to a word that is similar to the original word in the first sentence, but it's not the same. Ogidigbó, it turns out, is both a kind of dance, the music, but also a kind of instrument that is, at least in Shoyinka's mind, similar to Ogidigbó, but in real life isn't. And I will show you how he defines it. Ogidigbó, a Yoruba leisurely music, not a drum, music played mostly at the social occasion. The instruments include a resonance box with metal strips for plucking. Ogidigbó. So, because Shoyinka is Egba, is from a different dialect of Yoruba. By the time he was writing this book, there have been a couple of musicians who play this Ogidigbó drum and type of music using the instrument, which I'll show you in a minute. But the Ogidigbó drum had by the time probably become extinct or no longer a popular thing. And it's an Oyo type of drum. And so the end result we get from the translation effort is Shoyinka assuming his own mental, his own understanding of the drum, of the word, into Ogidigbó, which is a symbol and an instrument he recognizes, from the Ogidigbó, which is the original interpretation. I mean, there can be debate about whether this is a proper and acceptable way of translating. After all, translation is intended to bring the sense of the original work into the new reader, not necessarily always the exact same meaning. I've encountered this while working on Emily's work as well. So in bringing Ogidigbó into Ogidigbó, however, he created an issue that has become, that has changed the meaning of the word in Yoruba today. So at some point, Lagbaja in the 90s, the musician sang the following lines: Ogidigbó ń sọ̀rọ̀ ọ̀rọ̀ ìjìnlẹ̀, which is to say, Ogidigbó is speaking wise words. Again, Ogidigbó, until Shoyinka translated it this way, never used to be associated with wisdom, but with entertainment. But suddenly it has now become so. Like I said, Ogidigbó most likely looked like this: a hollowed out piece of wood that is drummed and used to say profound things for the benefit of the king. Ogidigbó likely looked like this, which is an instrument blocked with a hand. This is just to show you a little challenge that could happen when deviation happens, either through the author's conscious effort or a mistake, in changing the full sense of the word into society. But there's also a reason why this likely happened: the similarity of the word, Ogidigbó, Ogidigbó. When they're not tone marked, when they're written without any of the marks on top of them, they look similar. They look like it's just one word, and that's the difference. But when you put the markings on them, or when you hear it pronounced, you get to understand that the word is totally different. And of course, when you see the symbols, what they represent, you understand that they're totally different. This is a peculiar issue with Yoruba, where because it's a tone language, the words need to be written with appropriate tone marks for them to make sense. So Igba means calabash. Igba means rope to climb the palm tree. Igba means a garden egg. Igba means time. And Igba means 200. So these are different variations from one word that would look totally different if there are no marks on them at all. So this is a peculiar issue, which is why many of us, who are in writing and linguistics insist that, unlike many young people today who think that they can do without the markings, we think they should write Yoruba language with all the appropriate markings, except in the orthography of the language, so that the ambiguity can be reduced. But more importantly, when working in technology, one of the things I found is that insisting on putting the markings actually help to be able to better create a good technology. If you go to text-to-speech, ttsyoruba.com, which is something I worked on a couple of years ago, you could put in any Yoruba expression, and if it's properly tone marked, you can hear the sound pronounced. And if it's not tone marked, you would hear as terrible as the pronunciation would be. And so many people who read Yoruba or who are learning it need to understand how each of the tone marks work and which tone they correspond to be able to pronounce properly the sound related. But for people working in technology, it's more important, because then it helps the computer. You can better tell the computer that when you see this mark, this is the sound related to it and this is the word. But if the sound is not there, it makes it harder. English, I don't know, gets by that, gets by without any physical marking of words, and you can, because it's not a tone language. But still, when you say you're coming or you're coming, the presence of a question mark basically just tells the computer what it is. And when you are creating a text-to-speech synthesis product, it's not as hard as when you're doing Yoruba to have this kind of issues. So when I'm going to give you a couple of Google examples where you put in a word and expression, and without putting appropriate marks, Google just assumes that it's one of the things that it finds in its database. But when everything you find in Yoruba is properly marked, then it's easy to train the machine in how to recognize it. And when that happens, more people who use the technology can then benefit from the correctness of the output. And like in Srinika's case, one mistake, so to speak, in a literary translation can then become assumed into part of the corpus and then used for big tech and create a lot of ripple effects into the society. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples in Google Translate. This is one, Igba childhood. Igba is, is how we talk about childhood. Igba means time, like I showed you earlier. Ewe means youth. So Igba is a word for childhood. But like I said, the word IGBA means is not properly tone marked. But even if we tone mark it, I did this earlier, you find that it still just gives one instance, one meaning instead of two. Childhood should be written like this, Igba, Iwe. On 200 should be written like this, Igba, Iwe, as you can see. Google has more problems than just tone marks, of course, like in this case where I write with everything properly marked, and yet the context is totally different. The word, the sentence I've written there, Kojometa, means I haven't seen you in 3 days. It's a kind of greeting, so it's not direct. It's not said as I haven't seen you in 3 days. The word Eku there is one thing that is very common to Yoruba, which is we use for almost everything. Eku ile. I've just arrived home. I want to greet you. You're in the house. I'm just arriving. Eku ile. Ile means house. Eku ile means, I'm greeting you for having been there in the house while I'm not there. Ekaaro, good morning. Aro means morning. Eku, again, Eku aro, ekaaro. Just means, it's morning. Hi, we're in the morning together, I'm greeting you for being in this time with me. Actually, the Yoruba people used to be called the Aku people because we use Eku and Aku for almost everything. Ekaaro, Eku Jumo, Eku Osan, Eku Ijoko, etc., Eku She, and etc. But Google doesn't understand this. So it is my proposition that literary translation is a very important way to introduce more context and more nuance into translation, and that people working in translation have a role to play in providing as many of these important dimensions to the text of African languages, not just for the people who use the language and who get to read literature, but also for people who are tasked with creating text solutions that can benefit those who speak the language. Context and stuff like that can eventually help to move the language forward from just being one that is on the verge of extinction to those that can be used on the phones and technology, etc. I have been working in this space for a bit. If you go to yorubaname.com, you will see a dictionary that we have with all the words that are properly tone marked, and you can hear them pronounced, again, through efforts of text-to-speech. We're working on a dictionary of Yoruba proper, a monolingual dictionary as well, which will also hopefully provide some context and nuance for people who might need to build a corpus to be able to use for other things. And we need more translators in literary space, in literary space as well. So one of the reasons I'm working on translating works from English into Yoruba, or works by Nigerian language writers who even come from a different language background into Yoruba, is so that Yoruba can have as much text as possible to benefit the language, but also to benefit those who might want to create stuff like this. Impact of translation for the language, like I was saying, the expanded lexicon is one. Like I said about English, English now has, it keeps growing every day. There's a new word. Every year, there are new words added to the dictionary. But it's English that benefits from it. It's not the language from where these texts are from. But if we pay more attention to translating into Yoruba, into our own mother tongue, into African languages, then we expand those lexicons as well. There are words that exist in English that probably don't have equivalents in our languages, probably because we don't have them as items, or there are new words that have been coined, like bombs, for instance. It took a while, First, Second World War, for Yoruba to start finding words for bomb. Internet is a new one that came in, and we had to create and find words for it. The more we translate works that exist in those languages, the more we have the opportunity to expand the lexicon of our own language. It helps language revitalization. It helps mental stimulation. I can speak to that as a translator myself. I've spoken to the fact that it builds corpus for tech products, etc. Also, the kind of cultural exchange. We also know this. But like I said, also, the way it expands the vocabulary can be found in one example like this, Shoyinka's effort in the book that he translated from Dio Fagua, where many of these words were created out of thin air and are now part of the English language vocabulary: Bokcho, Gomi, Dewal, Nom, Kobold, because Shoyinka had to find ways to express ideas and images that exist in Yoruba spirit world, but do not exist in the Western ideas. He had to come up with this. But again, this benefits English language. There are ways that benefit Yoruba and other languages as well. Like when I was working on this work, I had to figure out how to find a word for snow, which doesn't exist in Yoruba because we don't have snow. The word has been thrown around for a bit, has a Yi, which actually refers to the frozen ice, which when it rains is hail instead of snow. And there have been different other ways of doing it. I settled eventually on Irididi, which is a combination of Iri mist and Didi, which is frozen together, like congealed mist. Because in the end, when you look at snow on the floor, it's really mist that's coming from the sky and then gets frozen and then comes down as a something that's my son. Sorry about it. That eventually becomes snow on the ground for distracted. Yeah. So snow is frozen ice. So I said, so there are many ways in which I believe that translating into our language, expand our imagination, gives us an opportunity to grow the language and make it work for us in different spaces. Let's move on to the next one. Yeah. So in conclusion, before I get to the end, I want to tell you a little story about how I came with Lingua Fracas. But before then, I think I've mentioned this. Let me see what else I'm going to add here. Anyway, my conclusion basically is that there are a lot of things that are helped by the fact that actually I'm just going to move on. Give me 1 second here. Please close. Can you help me close the door, please? Thank you. Put it outside. Please let me close the door. I'll come for it. Okay. All right. So the only thing I wanted to tell you is a short story of my trip in Rio de Janeiro in the fall of 2017, and what it told me about the possibilities of language in translation and the problems of translation. Before then, I had been using this word lingua fracas, basically to refer to instances where the inability to understand each other can cause disruption. Like, you know, a Lingua man and a Yoruba man meets and they have to do business and they don't understand each other, and the problems that they call from there, it's called lingua franca. But when I was in Brazil, we'd gone for a fellowship, and I was there with a couple of friends, one from Tanzania, one from Kenya. Both spoke Swahili, different type of Swahili, and we had finished the conference within the week, and then we were hoping to go explore Brazil because we didn't have the chance to do that at the conference. So we planned to go see the Christ the Redeemer, the statue of Christ the Redeemer, but none of us spoke Portuguese, which is the language of Rio, of Brazil. I speak English, they speak English, but they also spoke Swahili, and I also spoke Yoruba. And we would go to the street. When we decided to go eventually, what we told ourselves was that we would find a way to communicate using signs and symbols, and probably use Google Translate and stuff like that. But we were picking up the tickets at the first train station. One of the things we realized quickly was that using hand gestures were just as effective as speaking your own language to these Brazilians who speak only Portuguese. And so, I mean, you are there standing there saying, "Oh, I'm going to the Christ the Redeemer," and you're gesturing about what the Christ the Redeemer looks like, and you're trying to figure out how to say this in Portuguese. You realize that if you were speaking Yoruba at the same time, instead of speaking English, you get the same chance as being comprehensible as when you're speaking in English, because Portuguese and English are not totally similar. So I suggested to my friends that, try when you're speaking and trying to get the attention of this person, try to speak in your own language. You can still do the gesticulation, but speaking your own language as well. And it turned out that was it was just as effective. Again, it's not more effective than speaking in English, but it was just equally as effective. But at least it gave you the satisfaction of being able to speak in a language you're comfortable with, even though the other person doesn't understand you. So we did that to get the tickets, we did that to get on the train, to buy things and stuff like that. It was fun. None of us understood what each other was saying because I don't speak Swahili, they don't speak Yoruba. But we knew, we had agreed before how we were going to communicate, and I knew what the intentions were. So we finished, we went to the Christ the Redeemer, we went back, we came back, and on our way back, we went to a restaurant, and while we were sitting there, there was a riot happening in Rio that night. and there were some shootings. So the restaurant closed the windows, they broke everything down, closed the door, locked everybody in. We only had a TV to know what was going on outside. And while they were wondering and everybody wandering around, what was happening, we were going to ask them what was happening as well. And we asked them again in our languages. I was asking Yoruba, they were asking in Kiswahili, and the people who were listening to us didn't understand what we were saying either, but they were responding to us in Portuguese because they knew we were worried by our body language. And I found it quite interesting because communication did happen that day, and we understood exactly what they were saying to us. I think the word they said for protests, I think I've forgotten now, but I learned the word for protest that night because that was the response they gave us, like something was happening outside. Even though they didn't know what we're saying, they knew what we're saying, even though they didn't understand it. So I realized that lingua franca can also be a situation in which the inability to understand each other's language may not always necessarily be an obstacle in understanding the meaning of each other's experiences. And that has been a kind of guiding light for me in my work in linguistics and translation and technology. And I'm hoping that with more people's interest in translation, literary translation, technology, we are able to create a world in which our ways of life, ways of expression, means of communicating our humanity to the world can survive in spite of the limitations that technology brings, and that while that is happening, we also do much of our best to ensure that the technologies we use better reflect our ways of life, our ways of thinking, and the literature and translation, literary translation, gets to come to fill this space of lingua franca little by little until we get to a point where we can best understand each other, whether or not we understand what each person is speaking, but at least creating an opportunity for us to be able to understand what everybody is speaking, no matter what language you speak, no matter where you are from, anywhere in the world. I'm willing to hear your questions. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I hope you have learned something and at least been intrigued a little bit by the work I do and the opportunity that exists in the world for translation and for literature and linguistics and natural language processing. Thank you so much, and have a nice day, and I'll take your questions now.